Today we're going to make picture frames and canvases with curved corners. These are going to a local gallery, but you're also going to get to see me be bad at painting. I'm using a CNC to make these frames, but don't worry, I'll show you a way at the end of the video to make them with a jigsaw. I'm going to use my X-Carve Pro by Inventables to cut 3/4 inch plywood into the pieces that I'll use for both the frame and the canvases. I'm cutting these out as single pieces, which on the surface could seem wasteful, but I fit a bunch of smaller frames inside of the bigger ones so that I can get about 80 to 85% utilization out of each piece of plywood. I use low-cost sanded pine plywood to create the structures that I'll stretch canvas over, and I switched to a premium walnut veneer Euro ply from Columbia Forest Products to make some premium walnut frames. I use a jigsaw to cut the tabs that the easel software automatically places for the CNC machine. Every single piece that I cut with the CNC will be used for a project, and the outer frames will be cut into strips for conventionally constructed projects. You want a relatively sturdy frame for stretching canvas because in order to get the canvas tight, you have to pull pretty hard. I glued 2 layers of plywood together and let that glue fully cure before laying out a linen canvas, cutting it, and then stapling it to the plywood frame. There's a 1-inch wide plywood layer that is coming in contact with the face of the canvas. I then used a wider 1.5-inch wide plywood frame to give me a little more surface to staple the canvas to and to strengthen the frame but minimizing the amount of wood that's touching the tight canvas. For canvases smaller than 24 inches, I found that just a single layer of 3/4 inch plywood works just fine. This walnut plywood is a lot denser, heavier, and stronger than the sanded pine. And after cutting the tabs with a jigsaw, I use my flush trim bit on my palm router to clean up the tabs. I used a round over bit to give a nice radius on top layer of walnut plywood. Once my pieces were routed, I started gluing the layers together, starting with the top layer that I had just routed. I glued 3 layers together and used 99-cent spring clamps to hold them in place. Once the glue on these 3 layers had fully cured, I sanded the inside of them before adding on the 4th and final back layer, which is 1/2 inch wider. I glued and screwed that in place, but I was very minimal on the glue because I didn't want to squeeze out in difficult to sand corners. After sanding everything to 220 grit, I used a microfiber rag to remove the sawdust and then applied a thick coat of Maker brand Simple Finish. And boy, does it really bring out both the edge grain of this Europly and the top walnut veneer. I really like how the frames are looking, but before we get to my, well, amateurish painting, let's hear a word from the sponsor for this video, Masterworks. I studied art, design, and architecture in college. These creative fields are where my knowledge base is highest. I'm excited about working with Masterworks because I can finally invest in the areas that I feel knowledgeable in. Masterworks is a super exciting startup on a mission to democratize art investing. And after checking out their website and doing a little research, I invested in them myself. Masterworks is the first ever company to fractionalize blue chip artwork, allowing anyone to own shares of paintings by iconic artists like Banksy, Monet, Picasso, and so on without spending millions of dollars. They're letting everyday investors access fine art the same way wealthy folks have for generations. Early investors already saw over 30% net annualized IRRs in 2020 and 2021 from the sale of 2 paintings. And now you can join me and over 300,000 other Masterworks members and start investing too. My viewers can enjoy access to their latest offerings when you click on the link in the video description. So go check it out, browse around their website, and again, hit that link in my description, and I really think you'll like what you find. But this is not investment advice. Be sure to do your own research before making any sort of investment. Okay, back to the project. If you don't have access to a CNC, you can do this project with a jigsaw, but I recommend isolating the corners and cutting the different layers with different lengths of extension around that radius. This way you can splice these corner pieces together with straight pieces that you rip on a table saw. I recommend drawing the lines in pencil with a compass and then cutting just outside the line so that you can use a sander to sand to the line and get nice accurate results. If you have a router and a flush trim bit, then you can just make one really good corner piece and then clamp that down and use the flush trim bit to cut out the additional pieces that match it perfectly. You could absolutely build these frames out of scrap, and I actually think it would look really cool if you mismatch different types of plywood. I've always really liked abstract art and took a few painting classes in college, but was always struck that it's much harder to get the textures and colors exactly the way you want than it would seem. The interior design scheme for the new house that I'm building is very mid-century modern and minimal, and I thought some color and texture on a linen canvas would serve as a nice colorful punctuation mark. I worked in layers, diluted acrylic paint with water, and eventually got to a canvas that I'd give myself sort of a C plus B minus for. With paint, I really just didn't feel like I had enough control to establish the kind of textures I was interested in. So I turned towards materials that I'm more familiar with, in this case, lightweight gypsum plaster. This was a fun experiment, and I found that working the acrylic paint into it, I was getting some really nice even distribution of gradiated color and interesting textures as well. Next, I tried washing plaster over half-done paintings, but this time I used a pre-primed and gessoed canvas. I went back and forth between plaster and paint and was able to build up textures and control color. This one sort of looks like a nautical flag to me. I like the color, I like the composition, I like that it have a little bit of texture. But overall, I was feeling much more comfortable with the plaster than I was with a paintbrush. So for this third one, I decided to use a piece of plywood that was cut to fit inside the frames. I added fiber tape to help get the plaster to stick to the plywood. And I sprinkled lime-strong powdered pigment into the plaster and then created a texture with a moist microfiber rag. I was sort of able to work the pigments into the surface and really kind of push it down so it wasn't just a top coat pigment only. And it was really fun being able to work in color and apply the texture at the same time. I also liked that when working with plaster, you have the option to kind of sand and shape the surface after the plaster dries. The art installs inside the frames quite easily. Remember that wider lip that's 1.5 inches wide? Well, I just drilled some holes near the edge, and then I used some sponges to support the art piece, used painter tape to temporarily attach some 1/4-inch spacers, and then I just screwed through the wide strip of the frame and into the back of the artwork. Now, these pieces aren't headed for the Louvre anytime soon, but I do really like the curved corners on the frames, and they are going in a local gallery here in Joshua Tree, along with the log bench that I made in a previous video. I covered these canvases with quite a bit of paint and plaster, but I am thinking that I could use this design to create really cool mid-century modern looking acoustic panels just using a heavy felt or just fabric itself that is unpainted. Thanks to Masterworks for sponsoring this video. Be sure to check out the links in the description below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. Okay, thanks everybody. Bye.